morning, everyone. It's 8 o'clock, and so we're going to be looking at getting started this morning. So thanks again for joining us on this professional learning session this morning. We have Gary Pieters with us today to talk about the topic that you see there on your screen, driving change, exploring data on the Black student experience in the Ontario public school system, and unlocking change mindsets to improve outcomes. As we do each morning, we will be recording this session. And so if you want to have access to it later, if you want to share it, you will be able to do so. We will also be posting the PowerPoint along with the video for your use. And towards the end, as usual, Gabriella will post the link to the feedback form in the chat room, and we'd really appreciate you taking a few minutes to fill that out. It gives us some great information about planning next sessions and feedback that we can share with the presenter on the PowerPoint and the presentation, and what's been useful and what would be some good next steps for everyone. So we're happy to do that if you fill out the feedback form. At the same time, we do understand that you may have to be in and out of this session this morning, given other things that are going on, either in your home life or in your school life. We understand that these are particularly challenging times and that you may not be able to be attending through the whole thing, and that's fine. We do understand that. And so with that, I will pass it off to Gary to get us started.
Okay, thank you very much, Nadine, and good morning, everyone, and happy Earth Day to you. I want to thank OPC for doing this session. I think it's important that as educators, we have conversations about race, and that we have those conversations in a manner that's courageous, that's safe, that's fierce, and in a manner where we understand that there's no closure. And when I say no closure, I mean that the conversation continues even after we leave the room, because it's important that whatever we discuss, we understand it in the context of students and what the future holds in terms of our students and our student learning. So, as Nadine said, my name is Gary Pieters. I'm an educator and I am a school principal. I also am a member of the Ministry of Education Ministers Advisory Council on Special Ed. So I do advise the Minister of Education on any matter relating to special education programs and services for students with special needs. In terms of self-identification, I'm a Black male, I'm a Black Canadian, and I am of Caribbean ancestry, and I have lived in professional experience in the public school system in Ontario, both as a student, a teacher, vice principal, and a principal. And I also have lived and professional experience with anti-Black racism in the education system, both bearing witness and from personal and professional experience. The webinar aims to foster a safe and inclusive environment to look at anti-Black racism in education through data on Black students' experiences in school environments. We will look at many different themes in this presentation. We'll look at the anti-Black racism lens. We'll look at culturally responsive pedagogy. We will look at the lens of anti-oppression. We will look at policies and procedures, whether it's ministry or board policies. We will look at human rights principles. So there's quite an ambitious list of items to get through in the hour. If you have any questions, you can use the chat box to post your questions, and I will leave about 15 minutes at the end for question and answer. With that in mind, I would like to move on to an important aspect, which is the land acknowledgement. So next slide. I would like to acknowledge the presence of Indigenous peoples on the land on which we gather today across Ontario. I thank the past, present, and future caretakers of this land, where age-old centuries of celebration, initiation, and renewal took place. I am grateful to have the opportunity to work and learn on these lands in a community of sharing. And you can take a moment to reflect. All right, so next. So welcome to all school leaders from across the province in whatever capacities you hold. I've already provided an introduction to myself, and you know this session will be recorded and added to the OPC website. The slide deck will also be available. And at the end, we welcome your feedback and will provide a survey link at the end of the session. Next slide. So today we will be looking at what the data shows about how Black students experience school. And I mean, I've looked at data from many school districts across the province, but in this particular webinar, I will be using the most current data, and that's the data from Peel. We will be addressing anti-Black racism, bias, and microaggressions in schools. And I have listed earlier some of the lens of analysis that we will use to go through this. Then I will look at ways that we can drive change. And then at the end, looking at how we can unlock change mindsets to improve outcomes for Black students. And I use the word change mindsets because we all have to change our mindsets in terms of how we address Black learners and Black education in our schools. Next slide. So this document, the Ontario Education Equity Action Plan, is one of the documents that I plan to use. And the Ontario Education Equity Action Plan is an interesting, well, not really interesting, but it's quite an important document because the Ontario Education Equity Action Plan, what it does is it allows us to look at collection of data, and data in terms of many different categories, including the 17 categories of protected grounds in the Human Rights Code and other information. It allows school boards to collect comprehensive data on their student populations, and it allows them to also collect employee data as well. And you'll see that in the Peel demographic survey. The Education Equity Action Plan also supports the implementation of teaching practices, curriculum, and assessment that are culturally responsive so that students see themselves and their lived experience reflected in the built and learning environment. And I use the word built in there because the built environment is everything, what's on the walls, what they see in terms of the imagery around the school logo, how the school is described, if the school has like themes or logos, banners, all of those things are reflected in the built environment of a school. And the learning environment, of course, is everything from curriculum to the activities we do, to the events, to parent and community engagement, and the whole works. Next slide, please. And these are just some, and this is just a very minor sample of some of the type of approaches in terms of dismantling anti-Black racism or any of the other forms, manifestations that exist in schools. And culturally responsive pedagogy is it provides the means to do deep thinking and deep curriculum inquiry and deep learning that allows students to see themselves reflected in the curriculum, in the teaching, and in the learning environment. And the ministry and some school boards have been doing work through OISE, the Ontario Institute for Studies in Education. They have a Center for Urban Schooling, and the Center for Urban Schooling, they're the ones that that blended the term culturally responsive and relevant pedagogy. There were two Black scholars who came up with one came up with culturally relevant, and the other one came up with culturally responsive. Culturally relevant, was Gloria Ladson-Billings, and culturally responsive was Geneva Gay. So those are the two scholars that came up with that term. And then through the Center for Urban Studies, they blended it as culturally relevant and responsive pedagogy. So, and they do a lot of work, or have done a lot of work in schools. I was in one school in Toronto where they did a study. It was done, and there was research reports and everything else done on it. So let's move on to the next slide, because we'll come back to CRRP. And then the other approach we'll be looking at is this student discipline, and how student discipline is done in schools. And one of the aspects in the presentation will be looking at the over-suspension of Black students. But some of the most concerning aspects of it is that there's sometimes no context, or there's a lack of cultural lens. So students are being suspended for do-rags, for having hoods, wearing attire with hoods, or hoop earrings, and so on. So we'll look at bias-free approaches to progressive discipline. Next slide. And then we'll apply some human rights principles to bias-free discipline with an equity and inclusive lens. I didn't include certain statistics in the presentation, but I did take a look at the human rights complaints from the Human Rights Tribunal. So I had like the data on among the human rights complaints that are filed in terms of school districts across the province, and there are hundreds. And then they list the particular categories of those, those grounds of complaints. And so it's becoming, the human rights arena is becoming increasingly prominent in terms of parents and communities taking suspensions outside of the realm of school districts for litigation. So that's why I included this particular one on student discipline on the code and equity strategy. I helped to write this about 11 years ago. Well, 10 years ago, in 2011, we wrote this, and we rolled it out across the province. So as an educator, I collaborated with the other educators and the Human Rights Commission to do this, because at that time we were seeing problems in terms of how certain students, particularly Black students and Black male students, were being disproportionately over-suspended from schools or removed from classrooms with no context that's reasonable. Next slide. So then let's look quickly at the Human Rights Code, because it prohibits discrimination and harassment in 5 social areas based on 17 protected grounds, and those are employment, housing, services, goods and facilities, contracts, membership in unions or professional associations. And then the protected grounds, there are 17 of them listed there: race, ancestry, place of origin, color, ethnic origin, citizenship, creed, age, disability, sexual orientation, gender identity, gender expression, family status, marital status, receiving public assistance, records of offensive Yeah, and the reason why those are all important is because we all have intersectionality. So race is one of our parts of our social identity, but it also intersects with one or more of these protected grounds. So some of us have multiple exceptionalities. Next slide, please. And then in terms of the school environment, I think it's important to look at the issue of microaggressions. And microaggressions can fall under various continuums. So there's micro assault, which is verbal attack, name calling, avoidant behaviors, or purposeful discriminatory action. Micro insults, which is an unconscious insult demeaning a marginalized person's heritage or identity. And then there's micro invalidation, which is communications that exclude, negate, or nullify a marginalized person's thoughts and feelings of experiential reality. In this case, it's anti-Black racism. Next slide, please. So what is anti-Black racism? The term anti-Black racism was first coined in Toronto. It was coined in the early 1990s, and it was coined by a professor at Ryerson University, Dr. Akua Benjamin. And the term is now widely used across the world, but for the purposes of this presentation, we'll use the Ontario government definition, and it states as follows: anti-Black racism is prejudice, attitudes, beliefs, stereotyping, and discrimination that is directed at people of African descent and is rooted in their unique history and experience of enslavement. Anti-Black racism is deeply entrenched in Canadian institutions, policies, and practices such that anti-Black racism is either functionally normalized or rendered invisible to the larger white society. Anti-Black racism is manifested in the legacy of the current social, economic, and political marginalization of African Canadians in society, such as the lack of opportunities, lower socioeconomic status, higher unemployment, significant poverty rates, and overrepresentation in the criminal justice system. Next slide, please. Discrimination. What is discrimination? Discrimination is substantive, the negative differential treatment or impact. Negative differential treatment or impact could include being excluded, having benefits withheld, having burdens imposed. And some of the types of discrimination could be direct or indirect. It could be based on association with someone or an organization or a specific group. It could be reprisal. It could be racial profiling. Some people call it carding. It could be adverse effect discrimination. It can be systemic as in structural racism. It can be harassment, poisoned environment, or failure to accommodate. All right, next slide, please. And then there's implicit bias. Implicit bias is hidden or unintentional. They call it unconscious bias. And an indirect form of prejudice that is rooted in the unconscious mind. And that occurs with all of us. So everyone has an implicit or an unconscious bias. Next slide, please. So for the purpose of this presentation, we're looking at the Peel review, but there were many other reports that came out over the years. Some of the reports include the Stephen Lewis report in 1992. In 1987, when I was a high school student in Toronto, there was one that came out on my cohort called The Education of Black Students in Toronto Schools. There's The Roots of Violence by Roy McMurtry and Alvin Curlin. There's the Falconer Report, which people in Toronto and probably across the province knows about. And there are many more reports that came out that looks at the education, that touch on some way or the other on the education of Black students in the Ontario public school system, whether it's dealing with one board or system or across the province. So in the context of Peel, in 2019-2020, there was a review by the Ministry of Education that was conducted to address concerns around equity, anti-Black racism, governance, leadership, and human resources practices in Peel. For this webinar, we will look at the data from the Peel review and its impact on the Black student experience, achievement, mental health and well-being, and lifelong learning chances. I mean, for Peel, you can do many of these webinars. You can look at, in this case, the students, but you can look at staff, Black staff in Peel or racialized staff in Peel. You can look at many other aspects. So this is the type of, if you were looking at data and anti-Black racism, data in action, you can at least get 5 webinars out of the Peel review because of the different streams that they looked at in terms of governance, leadership, human resource practices, in terms of who gets hired, the accountability in terms of files, and all of that sort of stuff. But this particular webinar will look at qualitative and quantitative data, including achievement, suspension rates, student narratives, staff narratives, and disciplinary practices that Black students face in elementary and secondary schools in Peel. Next slide, please. So this is basically the partial chronology of what happened. In November 27th, the Minister of Education announced a formal review of Peel. December 30th, an interim report was submitted to the minister. February 28th, there was a final report submitted to the minister, and on March 13th, the final report and minister's directions were publicly released on the ministry's website. Next slide. And some of the key areas that it looked at in terms of Black students' experience in the schools in Peel included culturally unresponsive curriculum. So curriculum that the students couldn't see themselves, couldn't identify with. Students felt disengaged from the curriculum, and they felt that the curriculum had no relevance or meanings to their lives. The next area was overrepresentation in terms of the student programming. There was overrepresentation in applied, locally developed, and vocational courses. And on the inverse side of it, there was underrepresentation in academic and regional choice programs. And regional choice programs include things like gifted, IB, and that sort of thing. There was low teacher and guidance counselor expectations for the students. Next slide, please. There was harsh disciplinary practices and over suspension. There was evidence of data that showed evidence of implicit bias. There was data that demonstrated, some school environments and schooling practices that were deeply rooted in racial microaggressions, including name calling, schools being nicknamed, and student exclusions, but exclusions that seem to be, on the face of it as a principal and as a Black principal, unacceptable. And so basically also I put at the bottom there, navigating anti-Black racial school climates, because for a student that don't have the power in terms of when you look at power relationships, trying to navigate those type of environments, even for me as a Black male adult, is pretty stressful. And so I can imagine for a student trying to navigate an anti-Black racist school climate, the added burdens that it puts on that student while they're trying to learn. Next slide, please. We're going to take a minute, 2 minutes to watch this video from Peel. It was from a Peel board meeting that was covered, and you'll hear from the voices from the community in that video. Take a listen.
Concerns of anti-Black racism has been an ongoing issue in the Peel District School Board, sparking a meeting here tonight at the central office. Trustees are currently speaking. The audience is full of concerned parents and teachers.
Where they begin to think, am I a criminal and I'm not valued? Then they show up in math class feeling less than. That affects test scores on a very practical level. How do you excel in math when you don't think that you are a valuable, important part?
Anti-Black racism has been an ongoing issue in Peel schools.
Probably got to press the play button. Press play.
According to those who came here tonight to voice their concerns, including this Peel District School Board teacher who is speaking at the risk of her career.
It's the systemic racism that affects our students and their low graduation rates. It's the streaming. It's the low academic achievement. That's all public, so I'm able to speak to that. It's the low expectations that are set for our students.
Emotions got heated as 10 trustees voted on receiving the Integrity Commissioner's report regarding one trustee's comments back in June.
If a jolly trustee in good character comes and calls me, is that okay?
The Peel Board's Integrity Commissioner ruled in the report that Trustee Will Davies, who referred to McCrimmon Middle School as McCriminal, did not violate the Code of Conduct. A simple majority is required to receive the report. Report received. They got the majority vote. 6 trustees accepted it, 4 did not, including Nilka Dekrug.
When a comment like this comes about after you've put in so much time and effort into an initiative and resources, and a comment like that gets brought out, and then how it's dealt with, and just the cascade of the events that have been taking place for the past few weeks, it really it kind of brings to light that we still have a lot of work to do.
The Peel District School Board released this statement in part: as a board of trustees, we must not interfere with the Integrity Commissioner's independent process. Although a code of conduct contravention was not found, as a board of trustees, we will continue to uphold the Peel District School Board's values of respect and inclusion. Less than 2 weeks ago, the province announced an immediate review of the PDSB following a number of complaints. Education Minister Stephen Lecce says the review will look into allegations of anti-Black racism raised by families, students, members of the community, as well as members of the board.
The fact is, we take all these allegations seriously. There's no tolerance for anti-Black racism or any form of prejudice in our schools. That's why I've announced I'll be sending in 2 reviewers into the schools, into the board, to better understand how pervasive this issue is and to come up with a series of recommendations to root it out.
PDSB teacher Cheryl Woolnough thinks help couldn't come soon enough for the kids she says are experiencing racism.
We have to get them in a right frame of mind to know and to understand that they are loved and they are valued.
Minister Lecce says he will have recommendations from the review before the end of this year. Maliha Sheikh, City News, reporting from the Peel Board head office.
All right, so next slide, please. Let's get out of YouTube and we'll go right back to the webinar. All right, so we're gonna start off then. As you recall, I started off the presentation with my own social identity. If you wish to, you can put yours in the chat box so we have an idea of the social identities of the various staff and administrators and various community leaders who are participating in the chat. So in the webinar, actually. So this is the demographics for Peel. So in terms of Peel, I mean, what is, when we looked at the sort of representation, definitely there is some disparities. There's 67% of the teaching population in Peel self-identified as white, Caucasian, of different diversities. And then in terms of the students, 83% of the students in Peel are racialized. So 83% of the students come from a variety of multicultural groups, South Asian, Black, East Asian, other racial backgrounds, and so forth. And there's the indigenous population as well in Peel. But when you look at the statistics, they definitely show in terms of diversity that there's a diversity deficit in terms of the teaching staff, the leadership team, and so forth. And diversity, not only in terms of race, but diversity in thought, diversity in practices, you know, and so forth. And those practices include the CRRP lens and anti-oppression and culturally relevant and responsive pedagogy. And you'll see all of that coming through in the presentation. Next slide, please. All right, so let's look at student underrepresentation. And perhaps we can ask ourselves the question loudly or quietly, what is it that contributes? What is it that contributes to Black student underrepresentation in some programs and overrepresentation in other programs? As you recall, the presentation focuses on anti-Black racism, and streaming will be one of those factors that will come through as we delve deeper into this presentation. So when you look at the placement options of Black students in advanced, IB, and other regional high achieving regional programs, you can see that those statistical data are low. Black students represent 10% of the student population in Peel, and this is quoting directly from the report. They represent 10% of the student population in Peel, but they're grossly underrepresented in regional choice learning programs. Their participation in these programs are abysmal. And we will see some of the contributing factors to that in terms of where guidance counselors are directing our students and so forth. Next slide, please. Then in terms of applied, Black students, and this is again quoting directly from the report. Again, the data confirms that Black students are disproportionately streamed in the PDSB. The percentage of Black students in the PDSB by racial backgrounds in grade 9 and 10 in the majority of courses taken are as followed. Academic, 7.7%, which is almost 75 to 77% of the Black students. Sorry, in academic is 7%, my bad. Let me backtrack on that. 7% is pretty low in terms of academic. So it means 7% are in academic. So what's happening to the over 90, how much percent? Let's say about 92.3% of students. In applied, there's 21.7%. And in locally developed credit courses, they're 25.4%. In addition, the pass rate by enrollment in applied and academic for the past 3 years are as follows. When you look at applied in terms of the Peel board or in any board, for example, when you look at on the performance, on the achievement, applied, there's only 37%. 34% of the students, are reaching standard. In applied English, in 2017, 34%, and in 2016 is 35%. Whereas in academic, it's 90%. So 90% of the students in academic are reaching standard in 2018, 89 in 2017, and 89 in 2016. So what implications does that face for Black students in terms of choices and pathways? We'll get into that in more detail. Next slide, please. All right, so in terms of the data that we looked at, before I go into this particular piece, it is not just Peel that has this statistics. If you look at Toronto, for example, it's the same thing, you know, in terms of gifted programs, 1% in terms of the indigenous population of Toronto is in a gifted program. Blacks, same thing, 1%, Hispanic, 1%, and so forth. So basically, I guess you can use some of those same statistics and replicate them for Toronto, Peel, York Region, Durham, you know, some of the largest school boards, and you'll see that has large urban Black populations of students, and you will see the same Hamilton, and you'll see the same trends manifested, whether it's in suspension rates or in other areas, you know. But then the question is, what are we doing about it? Now that we know, and we've always known about this situation, what are we doing about it? What is the theory of action, and what type of steps must we take to look at this? Because in terms of Black parents, we saw the video, and we understand the state of Black outrage and Black rage at what's happening in the schools in terms of anti-Black racism and the inaction that's being taken to make schools a safe, affirming, and culturally responsive environment for Black students, and by extension, Black educators, school leaders, and so forth. All right, so next level data and next level impact in combating anti-Black racism in Peel. I mean, this is sort of the things that bear out in the report, not quoting them directly, but this is basically what I got out of it. You know, that definitely the data that was presented by Peel provides an opportunity for data-driven, evidence-based conversations with a change mindset. And that's what we're doing today. We're trying to look at this data and try to think about what are some of the ways we can change mindsets, both ours and system mindsets around Black student achievement, so that Black students are given the chance to reach their potential like every other student. Raise the bar to high expectations and achievement levels for Black students. We must disrupt streaming practices that hinder Black students' level of studies and placement and choices. We must embrace anti-oppressive, and restorative leadership practices. And restorative comes down to student discipline, creating positive school climates, which is all in PPM 144 and 145. Next slide. Looking at Peel implementation of the 27 recommendations, and the minister's directives are a must. It must happen and it must happen now, because the data is right in front of us, and the data presents a stark reality, and it's not looking back at the 60s when we talk about civil rights and, you know, education as a human right. It's not looking back at the 60s, or it's not looking at the Deep South. It's looking at education right here in Ontario. And that cannot sustain. That type of anti-Black racism is unsustainable, unacceptable. And since it's happening now, we have to look deeply at how we can change the trajectory, change the mindsets, and ensure that everyone has the potential to reach their aspirations. We must commit to disrupting systemic barriers, the community collaborations, by building trust. The community feels shut out in Peel and probably in other areas too. And how do we ensure that the community is centered in the whole conversation around Black student achievement? Is by giving them a seat at the table, listening to them sincerely, listening to them with our ears, our eyes, and our whole body, and taking what they say to heart, believing in what they say. So engage in transformative and transformational conversations with the Black community, and accept the narratives and truths you hear about anti-Black racism. So there's no denying it exists, and it's structural. It started when you look at the legacy of slavery and the destructive legacy of slavery, as a cascading impact, then you look at historically marginalized populations, and that's where Blacks in Canada fall within the realm of a historically marginalized demographic group. And then we need to look at sincere reconciliation with Black students, staff, parents, and advocates. Next slide, please. Looking at restorative practices with a trauma-informed lens to change zero-tolerance harsh disciplinary practices that Black students face in schools, because we no longer have zero-tolerance policies, but yet in terms of practice, in terms of how Black students are disciplined, definitely the practice seems to still continue. And how do we use data in the case of the data from Peel, Toronto, Durham, York Region, Ottawa, Hamilton? How do we use data on Black student achievement to better the learning environment and outcomes for Black students? And I will boldly say that, you know, when you improve the outcome for Black students, you achieve improving outcome for communities and societies at large, because definitely the connection between school and society is a strong one. And we do not want our students to be channeled into the school to prison pipeline. I live in the most urban part of downtown Toronto, and some of the things that I see living in this downtown core demonstrates the way schools have failed our students. And when school fails our students, the type of impact that it unleashes on society in terms of youth violence and some of the ills that comes with that. So let's inspire confidence in ourselves and others to engage in fierce conversations on rooting out anti-Black racism in our schools. And as I mentioned before, reconciliation must happen now by centering Black student achievement and well-being. Next slide, please. How can reconciliation with Black students occur? There's other reconciliations that have to happen with the adults too, right? But with the students, I think some of the ways that reconciliation can happen is by expunging and removing all those suspension records from those Black students for everyday attire that are culturally relevant and appropriate, including students being suspended for do-rags, for wearing a hoodie, for having hoop earrings and so forth. Like those aren't even within the realm of the ministry reasons for suspending a student. And yet that's happening in Peel, but other boards too. And so those records, if you want to reconcile with students, that would be one of the ways to reconcile with them, by removing those suspension records. You can imagine the face on a Black student in grade 12 if you go to them and tell them, well, you know, yeah, I know I suspended you for this. You know, we're not just telling you we're sorry, but we're removing this from your records. You're giving that student a fresh lens to look at the school system. You're building trust. You're letting them know that their culture and their identity is valued. We need to de-stream the course and program choices for Black students with a shift to academic and high-performing, you know, courses. I mean, Blacks are doctors, scientists. We had a Black president in the United States. We had a Black governor general in Toronto. We have Blacks principals, Black deputy ministers, assistant deputy ministers. We can't get to those positions if our children can't reach those positions if they don't get the education and the chance. So we have to de-stream so that they have the chance to get the right education and programming so that they can achieve their potentials as well. We must hire Black guidance counselors, Black principals and VPs, and we must sponsor. And sponsor is a deeper term than mentoring. We must sponsor those with AQ courses on the leadership track to move into leadership. And then student discipline must be done through an anti-oppressive and trauma-informed lens. So I think I'm gonna stop there. There's many other slides, but I'm gonna stop there and I'm gonna skip towards the end because I said I would leave 15 minutes for questions. So Gabriella, if we can move towards, let's see, slide. Well, no, we'll skip all of those. They can get those on the PowerPoint. You can share the PowerPoint with them. So the summary, there we go. The summary, what can we do? Definitely, there's a lot of work to be done, not just in Peel, but in all the school boards, to continue to do ongoing professional learning and building capacity and developing a change and growth mindset that pivots towards culturally responsive and relevant pedagogy. But culturally relevant and responsive pedagogy, not just in terms of the curriculum, but in terms of attitudes, behaviors, mindsets, developing a culture of critical inquiry, and having students be able to do learning and to build learning that delve deeper into experiences that they can relate to. And so they must see themselves reflected in the curriculum. They must see themselves reflected in the whole school, not just in terms of the faces and the bodies, but in terms of the mindsets as well, so that they can achieve, thrive, feel affirmed, feel loved, feel belonging, but also pushing them hard to be the best that they can be in terms of achievement. We must eliminate barriers and engage in authentic collaborations with the community. The community must be centered and recentered and re-engaged in these conversations because, of course, parents are the children's first teachers. The data must pivot change for the better now and into the future. So we cannot continue to build competitiveness by streaming students towards the bottom. We can't have a race to the bottom. We gotta have them rising to the top or reaching for the top. And then in terms of staffing, definitely Black male guidance counselors and females, teachers and school leaders. And that might, and in terms of the courses in the AQ courses, definitely, there'll have to be a deep look at what people are learning in these AQ courses, because the AQ courses definitely have to embed some of these principles of equity and inclusion, because we want to see these things in practice in the schools. Because I was at a conference last year where I raised certain experiences at one of the school boards, and I was sitting next to one of the directors of education from one of the school districts in Ontario, and he says, we have all these practices, but they don't translate to the ground. And I'm thinking, well, yeah, if they don't translate to the ground, then what should we be doing to ensure that those practices translate on the ground? Because when they don't translate on the ground, they affect the lives of students and adults. Next slide, please. So what I'm gonna do now is I'm gonna take a couple questions from the chat box. Let's see here.
Hi, Gary. There was one at the beginning of the presentation that states, what advice can you give to support the dismantling of anti-Black racism when your peers and system leaders continue to perpetuate racial hurt and harm towards Black students? How can I, by myself, do that when others around me do not see the need for change?
Definitely, you have to build alliances outside the system to pressure the system. So the system is vulnerable to change, but sometimes that change has to happen from the outside if the people inside are resistant, because the people inside that are resistant, they may have a certain level of built-in privilege and a system that supports that level of exclusion, which is not acceptable, not sustainable, but their policies and practices, obviously, that have to be brought to bear. And those policies and procedures include the school district's own policies and practices, the Human Rights Code. It includes other external levers of influence, and those external levers might be the community, might be other educators, might be people on the outside with a critical race lens who may be writing op-ed pieces and so forth. I'm a school principal, I'm an educator, but I speak the truth and speak my own truth in terms of anti-Black racism, regardless of what the system or what anyone thinks. And so what we have to do is find people that will have fierce conversation, allies from the outside and collaborators from the outside to bring pressure to bear on the inside. So external pressure when internal change isn't working. Any other compelling questions?
Yes, quite a few actually. We have another one that asks, how have Black-focused schools been set up to improve results?
Well, definitely, I was one of the first principal of a Black-focused school. In 2005, the Literacy and Numeracy Secretariat gave $140,000 for an Afrocentric summer school in Toronto at Shoreham. And I was that principal of that school at Shoreham, the summer school. It was a full day summer school that ran through the entire summer. And what they did is they collected data, the research. There was some research connected with it that collected data over a long period of time. And what they showed is within the summer months of that Afrocentric school, students who were A students maintained their A's. Students who were B students either remained at B or improved their outcomes. Students at C and D, they achieved at one grade level higher, achievement level higher. So if they were C, some of them became B. And if they were D, they became C, B, or A. So definitely in terms of achievement levels, when you have a culturally responsive school, the result does show in high student achievement. Even with the Afrocentric alternative school in Toronto that they established in the Shepherd Public School, when they looked at the EQA results for those students, the results was among the highest in the province. So definitely there is something about having a culturally, well, I wrote an article actually a few years ago. I haven't cited it here, but I wrote about my own experience as the principal of the Shoreham Summer School, which was an Afrocentric summer academy. And I wrote that culturally responsive pedagogy has a proven track record of success. If you want to find the article, you can Google it. It's in the Toronto Star, and it asks a rhetorical question. It says, who's afraid of Afrocentric? So definitely there are Afrocentric principles that have a strong grounding in the lives of students, is culturally responsive. The assessment, evaluation, the pedagogy, and the disciplinary practices are culturally rooted in a way that affirms students' identity and pushes them to achieve. Next question.
We have one that says, or asks, as leaders, what do you see as the critical ways to help and support teachers or staff embrace students seeing themselves in the curriculum? And have you seen classroom strategies that are moving that needle?
Definitely. In terms of, sorry, what was the first part? It looked like a 4-part question. So I might just ask you to repeat different parts because I'm not making notes.
As leaders, do you see the critical ways to help and support teachers or staff embrace students seeing themselves in the curriculum?
Yes. So one of them is definitely ensuring that learning is not from worksheets. So ensuring that when we're teaching and developing lesson planning, that is grounded in the lives of students. So if a student lives, for example, lives in a specific area and we're doing math and we're doing measurement or we're doing perimeter area, doing a community walk around the school and doing the math around things that the students see in their community, and they can measure those things, or they can bring things from home that can be used. Or now that we're doing online learning, it's a great way to incorporate the things that students have in their homes that can apply to their daily lives in terms of the curriculum. in terms of language and learning when we use textbooks and of ditching the textbook and using books that relate to student lives. When I was a grade 7 teacher and grade 8 teacher in Etobicoke at Albion Heights Middle School, in the early 2000s, the majority of students in that area were Sikh in my classroom. So what I did is in grade 7 and 8 history, I decided to do a study on the Komagata Maru. The Komagata Maru was a ship that brought, Indians to Canada. And then there's a movie called Continuous Journey that connects with it. And so I did the whole, in the immigration section, I decided to look at Sikh immigration to Canada using the Komagata Maru. And so that was in 2004. And 15 years later, if any of the students who are now grown adults encounter me downtown who are of Sikh descent or Punjabi roots, that's one of the first things that they remember about me. They say, you're the one that taught me about my culture because of the fact that you taught about the Komagata Maru. So we can find literature, books, resources that apply to student life. There's a lot of Black authors, Black Canadian authors, and their bookstores that have their resources that you can find that centers Black students in storytelling, whether it's on name calling, someone changing their name, there's books on name calling, Christopher changes his name, Amazing Grace. There's tons of books and so forth that you can find on culturally responsive ways to teach. Next part of that question. And we might go a couple minutes over 9 o'clock for those people who want to stay online.
We have another question. We have quite a few questions actually flooding in.
So let them flow. I am available, so I'll take them for as long as we all have the time commitment. Next one.
How do you protect the educators, parents, and community members that are vocal when they're advocating for Black students?
Definitely, advocating for Black students should be an essential human right. What is happening now is there are communities of collaborators from the outside that are paying close attention to education. So in terms of protecting, I would say that align yourselves with communities. So there's a Black Legal Action Center, there's a Black Action Defense Committee, there is, the Jamaican Canadian Association, there's a lot of organizations in Peel, PACE, and different groups in Peel and other regions in Ottawa, in Hamilton, in York region, there's VACA, there's, different education associations that work to advocate for Black students and educators. I would join those groups and try to form a critical mass of people that can push change and push for support so that if one person is facing repercussions because they support and advocate for Black students, Black teachers, Black principals, and VPs, that there's a community outside of that school that has the back of the people who are doing the advocacy, because when you go in there to do battle, there's a community outside that supports you. And I think that is basically how I see it, because sometimes in the school, you might be the only person or as a trustee, you might be the only person or have only one other person who is supportive. And that's a partial answer. Next question.
Hi, Gary, it's Nadine. I just wanted I'm going to suggest that we use all of these questions to maybe shape a part 2 to this session that you've led this morning. We have had a tremendous amount of people on the line this morning, and I really think that this is an important topic. And perhaps Gabriella has copy-pasted all of these questions into a separate document. And I think we could really use these questions to shape a second session where we could either do an open Q&A answer with you and perhaps a couple of other representatives of the Black community to help us delve deeper into this topic, and also to maybe share strategies of what's going on. There have been questions around data from specific schools and other school boards and other schools. So I think that we could probably stop here and use all of these great questions to share and shape a second session. If that works for you, I think we could do that.
It does. So thank you everyone for participating, and I hope that you had as much as you can from it. My contact information is at the end. If you can scroll to the next screen, it has my contact information. So you can reach me, or if you're tweeting on the subject matter, you can tweet on any of the topics that we discuss. You can use the hashtag anti-Black racism, hashtag Ontario Ed Leaders, Ontario Ed, or OPC chat.
And I want to thank you, Gary, for the time that you've put into preparing this session. I know that you've been through a few iterations of this presentation. I think it has been great information, very thought-provoking, has raised many questions, and I think that that's great. I think we need to be having these conversations. I mentioned that in the chat at one point. I said that we needed to be having these conversations and learning with and from one another. And understanding is part of the way to solutions. And somebody commented in the chat that Stephen Lewis's report from years ago, 30 years ago, made some of the same recommendations of what we're still talking about today. So clearly, we need to find ways to move forward on these issues and helping our kids do better. And that means that we as adults need to do better. And so I think that this, as we turn our minds to a next session, and then beyond these daily professional learning sessions that we are doing at OPC, we need to turn our minds to how we will continue to support this work once we're out of this crisis and maybe not doing quite as much daily professional learning for our members. These topics remain important to us, and we will continue to work. So as those of you who are still on the line are completing the feedback form that Gabriella will paste into the chat, I would encourage you, there's a question there on what would be some next steps. If you have questions that have not been answered through the chat, or you haven't had a chance to post them, because we will copy those, please go ahead and put those questions in there. If you have suggestions of specific topics for next steps, please do that as well. And we definitely use that feedback to inform the planning of all of our sessions. So we do read that feedback, and unfortunately we're not able to always action all of it, but we are keeping track of it and hoping that it will inform our professional learning for the months to come, as well as the weeks to come, as part of our response to COVID, to provide these sessions every day. So thanks very much, Gary, and everyone on the line, and enjoy the rest of your day, and hopefully we'll see you again on some of these sessions. Thanks very much, everyone.
Thank you. All right, so Nadine, what did you think?
I think it was great. That, you know, I was looking at the numbers, and normally we have about between 50 and 60% pickup rate for our webinars. This one had 90% of people who showed up, who registered and then showed up, which is, we've not seen that in any of our sessions. So I think it speaks to the need for more work on this topic and the importance of people dialoguing. So Gabriella will we'll collect the data from the Google form probably tomorrow. We'll give people the day to complete that, and then we'll share that with you.